Welcome to the PAPI and Python automation of Akamai presentation. Really, the intention of this is not to just kill you by death by PowerPoint. I kind of designed it as more of a question and answer thing. We'll get into that later. It's just kind of like if you're doing some development, it doesn't necessarily have to be Python. It could be Perl, whatever. If you're just trying to maybe develop an application and you're stuck and you don't know where to start, and you don't really need, like Akamai CLI is not enough for you, and you need to do some custom things. The purpose of this is just kind of help you with that. So yeah. I'm John Councilman. I'm an enterprise architect at Akamai, and I'm part of the global consulting service. My boss wanted us to put this little blurb in here. We accelerate our customers' business through a partnership focused on expertise, innovation, and education. These are all this stuff actually centered on the project I did with BAMTech. We learned a lot on integrating the APIs into Python, and I've documented a lot of it, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. Some of you were at the BAMTech talk, and they referred you here. So let's proceed. All right. This is again about the GSS team. We typically work with some of our largest customers, and we do like monthly assessments, and we focus on optimization of the Akamai platform as well as custom solutions. So basically, if you're interested in having us help you with any kind of projects, you can just get with me after this, or just email consulting@akamai.com. And we do API consulting as well if you're stuck on some of your software development. So the objectives of this class, we want to basically just understand where to obtain information about Akamai APIs. We want to understand how to initialize the Akamai authentication and begin development framework, and then we want to get enough background information to incorporate Akamai into custom applications. And then again, I want to focus on Python on this, but I've integrated the same APIs in Perl, and we support PHP, JavaScript, Go, quite a few other languages as well, and I'll get into that later about where to find everything. So like I said, again, the general idea of this presentation is to focus on what's needed to integrate Akamai into your Python code, and just need to answer any questions you might have holding you back from any of your development. And then again, this is me. I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm on our enterprise architecture team. There's about I focus usually on media, and there's about 6 of us right now. All right, API documentation. Show of hands, who's actually been to developer.akamai.com to go through the APIs? All right, who's actually using them though? Cool, cool. Is it CLI, or did you actually integrate it in your code? Both? I'm sorry? Okay, cool, cool. All right, let's see. Yeah, here it is. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide change. My notes are actually off a little bit. Sorry about that. Well, anyway, we have the APIs are divided into 3 different methods. Typically, we have a post, get, and put. And I noticed when we were working with the APIs, it never really made sense. If I was doing a get groups call, obviously that's a get. But if I was like publishing a new configuration or just updating maybe Edge host name, it's like, is that a post or a put? And it's usually just fairly hard to remember. Typically, HTTP post is used to create a new item, get is used to pull information via the API, and put is used to update an existing item. But the nice thing is you really don't have to know. The developer.akamai.com site tells you exactly which one to use. So that's kind of the point I want to make about this, is the documentation is surprisingly really good. And also, one thing that when you're actually doing the development, you're not using the Akamai CLI, is you have to pay really close attention to the headers. Using the Akamai CLI, that's usually done for you. If you're developing your own application, each one of these methods, whether you're pulling a configuration, updating a configuration, or whatever, requires specific headers. And if those headers are missing, then the whole call is going to fail. And then this is an example of the request and response format. Of course, when you're actually working in the CLI, I'm sorry? Sorry, that's my last question. This is an example of the request and response formats. As you can see, this is a GET request, and then the responses are always in the JSON format. And the nice thing about Python, when you use the HTTP API within that, it automatically includes the JSON parser. So it makes a lot of this really easy to parse out, and I'll show you that later. All right, so setting up your first application. Who here has done API credentials at all inside of Luna? I was going to do a demo of that. Okay, good, not very many people. Okay, great. A good bit of this is actually talking about how to do the credentials and some gotchas there. So you have to retain one or more sets of API credentials from within your Luna account. And in the case of like Property Manager, there's a Property Manager API, and then we also have like a Certificate API. And in the case of that, you have to have two separate sets of credentials, one for certificate creation and one for PAPI. That's not always the case, but it's, when you go through the API, we'll look at it in a minute, it kind of spells it out when you create your APIs. And then again, if you're using net storage, it's not necessarily an open API, but it does follow a similar workflow, and then that's an additional key that has to be requested. So that's something we found out as well. And that will be opened up towards the open API pretty soon. So then, yeah, you populate the API into your application once you receive it, and then you can do a test GET request, and then you can just begin coding. And then towards the end of this, I'm going to show you how you can test without using Python, because typically what I found is when I was developing the applications is some particular call would not work within the application, but the call was perfectly fine. So what I typically used was the HTTP IE tool. Has anybody used that? Okay, great. Yeah, and that's a lot simpler to test your code because you can just do it all in one command and then look at the response. If you receive a response there, then obviously the API works, you have access to it, and then you can troubleshoot your application. So I want to show you that as well in a little while. Okay, the API credential request. This is under the Configure tab, right underneath where you manage your users and groups. Yeah, under Manage APIs. And sometimes sometimes we have to first create a user first under Manage User and Groups solely for API usage. If you'd like to do this, yeah, first you need to create a new user, then log in with that particular user. As the Manage APIs interface is associated with the user you're logged in as. I see a couple of orange tags for Akamai employees. You've probably noticed if you log in with your Akamai account under maybe a customer account and you want to use the API for that, it won't work. You have to create a user under that account that's specifically for that account if you want to associate an API with it. So if you have access to multiple accounts with your username, then you want to create a specific username for the account that you want to manage via APIs. So keep that in mind when you create your credentials. Okay, and then in this case, if this is the API credential request, once you navigate to that, and if there's already credentials created, they'll be listed here. And then to create a new API client, just click New API Client for me. Again, this is associated with the user you are logged into, and not some other user. So you want the person that's actually using that API to log in and create the API credential. If you're using some kind of automated script, which if you're in this class you probably are, you'd probably want to create like a machine account, like application at yourcompany.com, and then log in with that application user, like a service user, and then create an API for that. All right, and then in this case, I usually just leave this as is. If you have multiple products in your account or multiple directories, you can go in and say whether this user is going to be an admin or read-only or for each particular subdirectory. But typically I just leave this as is and just leave it as admin, because the user itself, I usually just like to manage the credentials for that user itself, and then let the API just follow through with that. Okay, and then notice there's two filters on here. We have the open APIs and we have the CCU APIs. Can you see that okay? And this resolution's a little off. Yeah. Okay, the CCU APIs, that's actually for fast purge. There's a totally different set of APIs for that. So you'd have to create a separate API key if you wanted to do fast purge. And then you create another API key if you wanted to use Property Manager or CPS. Okay, and then this right here is the actual credentials request. And once you do a new credential, we'll do that in just a minute. I'm going to walk through the whole thing. When you do a new credential, it'll appear on the screen for like, I think it's 120 seconds. And make note of it right away. Save it like in a notepad somewhere secure, because it will not show up again. If you want to see those credentials again, you will have to create a new set. So this is actually what appears with the credentials. So so as you can see here, this particular one says it closes in 115 seconds. So obviously I opened it 5 seconds earlier. So you have 2 minutes to save this information, and if you don't save it, then all you have to do is just create a new set. All right, application setup. Before I go into that, what I want to do is just do an actual walkthrough of API creation, just so you can see that in real life. So I'm logged in to a user that's associated with this particular account. This is one of our internal accounts. I go under Manage APIs. Hopefully the connectivity is good. It hasn't been lately. Who loves live demos at conferences? Yeah. Yeah. Look at you. All right. So as you can see here, I have several clients. We created, I've got 4 clients created here, and they're associated with my particular username. As you can see here, I created a specific username for this account, because I'm not able to manage any other accounts right now. So that's really the only way you can create an API for security reasons. I can either edit an existing client and add additional keys, or I can create a new client. So I'll just walk through exactly what we went through here. I'll do a new API client for me. I'm an admin for this all hands group. I could just unassign it or block this, but since I do want to manage it, I want to be an admin. I'll name my client John Edge. And then this is where I assign each individual API to this machine. So I can find Property Manager, and you can say if I want read write or read only. So I want read write, so I can be able to actually update a property. And then CPS if I want to provision certificates. So I'm giving this particular client, which would be the application that's accessing this API, and this is all the access that they are getting. So I could, if you wanted to write an application to interact with billing, you could do that. Any of your support cases, cloudlets. But in the case of this demo, I'm using CPS and I'm using PAPI, Property Manager. So I'll submit that. And then as you can, this looks just like the PowerPoint we just went through. So I have the owner created, and then authorizations, which is the URL. If you want to write this down, feel free, because I'm going to delete it when we finish. And then new credential. So as you can see here, it closes in 2 minutes. So I can just copy it to a clipboard. And then normally you would place it into an Edge RC file. But in the case of this demo, I'll place it in here just for demonstration, and I'll call it Edge. Is anybody familiar with the Edge RC file? Okay, good, just a couple. This is typically how we would manage authentication to the API if you're using like some sort of Unix type machine. It's just a .dot file in your home directory, and you can have each particular API that you're using. In the case of here, it's PAPI, and then I have a default, and then I have a CCU API. And if you're using Akamai CLI, this is actually where it reads your tokens from. And if you're using HTTP-IE, it also reads the Edge RC file, and that's where it gets its authentication information from. In the case of Python, you can use one of two ways. I want to show you our GitHub library in a minute. You can either use the Edge RC file and have it read from that. Our libraries automatically know about that, or you can just embed the tokens directly into your application if you don't want to be able to. If you don't want to have to worry about having the Edge RC file on your like maybe for a web app or something. So in the case of here, I'm saving this information on the Edge RC file, and then I could close it, or they'll do it for me in 20 seconds. Excuse me. And that's all there is to it. As far as creating the API, I'm ready to go, and there's no. Go ahead. Yes. No, I'll show you that in 1 second. Typically you would just use default. The file is .edgerc, so it's like a .bash profile or something in Unix. It's a typical .dot file. Typically you would use the defaults, and sometimes Akamai CLI wants you to have one called PAPI, that it calls that internally. And if you're doing fast purge or something, if you're doing purge, it typically wants one called CCU. That's just what it knows about internally to call. If you're using HTTP-IE, you can call it whatever you want to, because you actually specify the section that you're calling. And then if you do not call it anything, it typically uses the default. Go ahead. No, you have to add it. There's no Edge RC file on your server, so you would just paste this in, and if you're just doing basic things, default is fine. Go ahead. Question? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which is the permission I need to give, or I want to get a report manually with the API to get the three most used resources of
right.
Making it most traffic in my account. There is a way to understand that quickly from the interface which is the correct permission.
Well, if you were editing an item, you would use read write. If you're just writing an application that's like pulling reports, then you probably want to use just read only, because you don't want to allow that application to be able to. Oh, right. Oh. Yeah, that's all in the developer.akamai.com site. Each one, when we went back to, if I go back to Luna, and if let's say I do a new one, we'll just start over. They match up with everything in the Akamai API catalog, so you typically can just, it will automatically autocomplete. So I just start typing in reporting. So here's reporting API, which sounds like what you're asking about. If you wanted to pull information about like IP addresses, and then you can come over here and do the same thing. And Let's see.
In case the IP was for filtering this network, it's for filtering in for different stuff. So being able to add a new IP with the script from use some network risk.
Yeah.
Right, network and that's the set and then it's up here.
Yeah, give it after we finish, and we can kind of look through it, and you know, we might can find it. I'm focusing here on property manager and certificate provisioning.
Now, what I need to understand is, for example, in the interface with someone, I don't know, button where you say, okay, to use this, there is this permission or something smart like this, or I have to go inside the.
Right, right. Yeah, let's look at it after after this is over with. And we might have to take a little bit of research in this website here. All right. So now the fun part, the application setup. All of our libraries are on GitHub. We have right here. We have obviously we've talked a lot about CLI. But if you go into the API Kickstart part of GitHub, we have examples here for Perl, PHP, Python, and Ruby, and there's others as well. You can just you can just put in a support case or email us, and we probably have it. It's just not published right now. I have seen some in Go as well. So in the case of like PHP, I can go there, and then here's the Kickstart. It tells you exactly how to set it up, how to generate the Edge RC. And then there's some quick start libraries on each one. So like some init scripts, and there's plenty of examples in here that, for each API. So Python, for instance, you can go under here and like events, config, CCU. So these are all basically just examples that you can use to, you know, as it says, it's a quick kickstart for your application, and plenty of examples in there. And in the case of Python, typically this is how you would start your application. You would import the edge grid after you download it from the Kickstart. In the case of here, I'm using URL join. I'll show that later to combine the Akamai endpoint and then the API endpoints. And then since we respond on everything in JSON, you need to include that. And then also, I typically make heavy use of the regular expression engine in Python, because sometimes the response is maybe you're looking for like a group ID or something in the response, and it might be only contained within like a path, and it's usually best just to pull it out with the regular expression. 99% of the items returned are easily accessible via JSON, but every now and then you have to parse a string and pull out something. And then in the case of Perl, I just put this as an example because I've been doing a lot of Perl development against the API. You would start your application like this. You would just, again, the Kickstart would include the Akamai Edge Grid. You would download that through CPAN. You would use the JSON library. Decode JSON is all you really need, and then you typically make use of data dumper as well. All right. Any questions about what's needed to start an application? So I'm going to go directly into the terminal in a minute. All right. So let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, what I typically like to do before I start anything is I like to test it in HTTP IE. So if I want, let's say my application, I just want to do a listing of all of my properties. I need to write it in Python, but I want to make sure that my keys worked, and I need to make sure I'm using the right API. So what I typically do is I set up the keys that we just created in the Edge RC, and then I'll use HTTP IE. And this is where we were talking about earlier. We can call the section on HTTP IE when you use the Edge Grid auth type. That adds the -A option. You can specify which section of Edge RC to use. So in the case of this, I just want to use the default. and I can call it, and then this will give me a JSON listing of all of my properties. So in the case of this, the application, the API works, my API key is enabled, and there's no issues, so I can start developing. So I hate to start developing and then my API key be wrong and I get denied and all kind of errors when I could have just done some diagnostics on the command line first. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's under the. See if you go to the HTTP, if you go to the API kickstart, again the github.com/Akamai, and you go to HTTP-IE-edgegrid, you can download it from here, and there's instructions on how to install it. It's basically via Python, and then the usage is right here with the this is the edgegrid RC, edge RC that we just went over, and then it gives you the examples of the command line. So you can do so as you see here, we're calling it the default, and in the case this is using diagnostic tools. So it's also available on GitHub, same place you get the application kickstarts. All right, so I'm going to go into this. I have this edge demo Python script. So what I'm doing in this case, I'm calling it with command line arguments. The nice thing about doing the APIs through your own application is you can integrate it directly into like a web app or something. As you mentioned earlier, reporting. You don't have to worry about calling like a command line, like a binary every time you want to do like get like a report or something. You can just integrate it directly into your application. Or if you had a command line script that's doing something and you want to migrate it into web, some kind of a web application, you're able to do that. Where you could just say, okay, I want to create a new config, or I want to create a certificate. You could just input like an email address, have some things pre-populated, and then it generates a certificate for you. So as you can tell, in the case of this is exactly the same API that I use under HTTP-IE, but this returned JSON. And in the case of this, since I'm using the JSON module within Python, I'm able to parse the JSON as it comes back and generate it in a human readable format. All right. So in the case of here, as you can see from earlier, we had the URL parse and the URL join, the JSON module, regular expression module, and in the case of this, I'm using the argument parser. So that way I can parse command line arguments and provide like help when somebody's using this. And then as you can see here, I'm using the edgegrid library. That was available on GitHub. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you have a choice of whether you want to add your tokens within the script, or if you want to use the edge RC. The GitHub library for the kickstart, it has both options, and it documents both options. And it's really up to you which way you want to do it. And one note about the API keys, once you create them, they expire within a year for security reasons. So there's really two options that we've come up with. Number one is within your application, if you start getting denials from the API, you could trigger maybe an email to an admin to say, hey, you might want to renew your keys. Or we recently added I guess you can call it an API. We have an API to request new API keys. But I don't know how comfortable you are using an API to get new API keys. So, but it's available if you want to. Either way, if you start getting denials after a year, that's why they only last 1 year. Okay, and in this case, as I mentioned before, this is just one example of creating a new property via the API. You go back here. As you can see here, since I'm using Python, I'm creating a base URL based on the domain name. So let me go back and do edge RC. As you can see here, we have a host in there. But this isn't an HTTP format. And of course, if you're writing it in Python, you need an HTTP format. So really you just need to prepend HTTPS in front of your host name, and then add a slash after it, and then this is where the URL join comes into play. So we'll go back to a property creation command. So I add the I look through the API, and so I wanted to do create new property. That's what I'm trying to do. Create a property. So as you can see here, this specifically says it's a post command. It's not a get or it's not a put. Typically it puts only when you actually modify a configuration, when you're actually sending JSON upstream. So we're sending a post to /PAPI/v1/properties contract ID group ID, and they give you a sample, and they give you the request body. But as you can see here, make note of the required headers. So if you do get a denial, you probably missed the headers. So as you can see here, I'm sending headers, content type, application, JSON, and the pragma headers. If I left this out, more than likely I would probably die on me. And then I'm sending it to, as you can see here, this is the base URL that I received from the key. And then this is the end URL, which I'm calling here, which I'm generating, which is the rest of the URL that the API requires. And then I'm building the query strings on the fly as well. And this is all based on, you know, if you're using a web app, obviously, like, you know, form variables. If it's a command line, it's just the variables within the argument parser. And then, like I said, we're just using the standard HTTP libraries, and we're just wrapping it with edge grid authentication. So I'm just able to send a post command, and then the required headers, and then if I am sending data, then I would send the data, which I am actually. So I'm generating the JSON that's coming up from. This is the JSON that I'm generating. I've got a guy that sits next to me at work that's a lot better at Python than I am, and he said I shouldn't be doing it this way. So don't judge. He said I should be using the Python libraries to generate JSON, but you know, this works fine. I mean, I might actually take his advice later on. But anyway, I'm generating the JSON, and then that's the data that I'm sending upstream. And then in the case of this, it's a post, the data that's going upstream, the headers. And then I'm able to this is a standard HTTP library. I can get the status code back in case I need to make some, do some reaction to it. And then I'm also getting the text for debug. And then you can, you know, obviously look at the status code. And then the case of here is 201. You know, typically you would think of 200 or something is what the response would be. But when you come to the API library and look at response, it will tell you specifically what the status of success will be. In the case of here, it is a 201. And then, yeah, here we go. And then again, what I mentioned before, the nice thing about Python is the JSON library is already built into the HTTP library. So when you get the result from the API, it's easy just to parse the response using without having to, you know, do like, you know, if you do it in Perl, for instance, it has a JSON library too, but bad example, but you don't really have to parse the entire JSON to look for something. You can just use the built-in JSON parser in Python and pull back the, you know, the exact section that you need and assign it a variable. So in the case of this, it's a link to the property that, that I just created, and I can use that later on in the script. And then here's another example of using regular expressions. So in the case of this, I wanted only the property ID out of that property link. So I'm using a regular expression to find it. So this kind of combines everything we talked about. Okay, and then one more thing I wanted to show you. This is an end-to-end where I'm going to create a secure host name. And this is using the certificate API. So this is kind of using an actual Python script. It's calling this CPS API, and what it's doing is it's requesting a certificate signing request. And the nice thing about using Python or in another programming language is you can do things like this. In the case of certificates, it takes a while for it to actually come back with, yes, we're okay, we've created a certificate request. Sometimes it's instant, sometimes it might take a minute or two. It's very similar to like activation. Like if you wanted to activate something and see if it's actually activated, it's not going to be instant, and even fast activation takes a few minutes. So the nice thing about the writing it in Python is you can wait for a particular response and then continue, and you don't have to worry about user input running a separate strip. So in the case of this, as you can see, I was waiting for his 200 status code to come back, and I was waiting for state running. So once the state of the certificate request changed from running to awaiting input, then I could proceed. So the nice thing, like I said, about Python is you can do things like that. So let's see. That's really about all the time I've got. We've got like 4 more minutes, so I'd like to just open it up for questions and answers. Probably a ton. I can't really go over the full development life cycle in 40 minutes, even though I try. And I'll be around for another hour if anybody wants to meet as well. But if anybody has any questions for the group, we've got about 4 minutes. You go ahead. Unfortunately not, because a lot of it's, I'm using it for a particular customer, and I just obfuscated it. But if you have any questions, I can help you out with it, and we can pick pieces out of it. Yeah, I'll be here for about, I have nothing else this afternoon. I'm flying out at 3 o'clock, so I'll be here for maybe a couple more hours. If anybody has any questions, I'll be around. And yeah, we can. I don't mind logging in and helping you maybe debug some things. And yeah, I'll be around. I'll be hanging around this area here in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. The nice thing about the API is that if Buddha is doing something, it's using the API. So it's not like Buddha does anything different than the API does. A lot of times if I'm trying to diagnose an API, what I'll do is I'll actually bring up the code developers who will probably do the same thing in Buddha. And just use the API in the background and see how Buddha does it and how to take that. Because Buddha's using the same exact API. Yeah, yes, actually. Sometimes it's even though it's documented in there, might be like missing one piece that I need. It had like one good example is when you go to certificates. The certain account requires a state standard SSL or an SSL that standard SSL is on the contract with data. And if standard SSL is on the contract as a data option, the API does the same thing about using that. But if I did this, sorry. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, so if I did the same, so if I went into Luna and say, create a certificate, I see that Luna's sending standard SSL. I'm like, oh, okay, so obviously that's how it's done, because Luna's actually using the same exact API as we are. So if you, yeah, that's the easiest way to diagnose something, if it's not working like you think it is. Sure. Anything else? We have maybe 30 seconds. But like I said, I'll be around for about an hour or two. If there's any questions, I'll try to help.